Today, it's really my honor to introduce our presenters, Dr. Nancy Ammerman and Dr. Hosffman Ospino. Hosffman Ospino is Assistant Professor of Hispanic Ministry and Religious Education and the Director of Graduate Programs in Hispanic Ministry right here at Boston College in the School of Theology and Ministry. He was born in Columbia and taught philosophy and religion at various academic levels in Columbia and worked for the National Confederation of Catholic Education there. He subsequently earned a master's degree in theology and a PhD in theology and education from Boston College. Dr. Ospino's research focuses on how the conversation between faith and culture shapes ministerial and educational practices in the church. He's probably been most involved most recently as a principal investigator for the National Study of Catholic Parishes with Hispanic Ministry. His report from this study were published in 2014, and he is at the forefront of the conversation about the growing Hispanic presence in the American Catholic Church. Dr. Ospino has a long list of academic articles, chapters in books, and general ministerial publications to his credit. He is editor of Hispanic Ministry in the 21st Century, Present and Future, and the author of Peter's Catechism, Who Do You Say That I Am? Why Did You Doubt, and Do You Love Me? That came out from Encore in 2011. He is currently writing a book on multicultural Catholic parishes to be published by Fordham University Press. He is a much sought-after speaker. You really can't go to a national or even an international event these days and not hear Hosffman. But he enters into that, from his own deep personal commitment. He and his wife, Guadalupe, are actively involved in Hispanic ministry here in the Archdiocese of Boston. And really here at Boston College, it's really been my privilege, to work with Hosffman on a number of issues. And within continuing education, we regularly offer programs to meet the needs of leaders within Hispanic ministry. So glad to have Hosffman with us. And our first presenter for today is Dr. Nancy Ammerman, who works at the intersection of theology and sociology and holds a PhD from Yale University. She is professor of sociology of religion at Boston University School of Theology and the Department of Sociology. And she's director of BU's Graduate Division of Religious Studies. Nancy began her career teaching at Emory University's Candler School of Theology for 11 years, followed by 8 years as a professor of sociology of religion at the Hartford Institute of for Religion Research. She's been teaching at Boston University since 2003. Dr. Ammerman has spent many years studying American religious organizations, especially congregations and denominations. Her first book, which was published in 1987, was Bible Believers, Fundamentalists in the Modern World, a study of an independent Baptist church in New England, exploring the way in which its members make sense of the world around them. Her award-winning book, Pillars of Faith, American Congregations and Their Partners, was published in 2005 and describes how America's diverse congregations do their work. She has also written extensively on conservative religious movements. Dr. Ackerman's most recent research has focused on the social structures and practices of everyday lived faith. Again, her latest book, Sacred Stories, Spiritual Tribes, Finding Religion in Everyday Life, which is published from Oxford University Press in 2013, documents the way religion and spirituality operate across the many domains of daily lived experience, both within and beyond the boundaries of official religious institutions and practices. Dr. Ammerman has served as president of the Association for the Sociology of Religion and other professional organizations. She's lectured widely in the United States, Europe, Israel, South Africa, and China, and she is frequently quoted as a news force on a variety of topics. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Nancy Ammerman to Boston College today. So let's welcome her.
Thank you all for your presence here and for the commitment that represents to the work that we're all engaged in thinking about how people live their faith in the world that we're in these days, and the kinds of challenges that we're all facing as we try to gather those people into communities that can be lively and supportive and nurturing communities for the people in them and for the larger world in which they're located. When I proposed the title or the subtitle for this morning of Living in Tabernacles, I was asked, would you explain that, please? And the reason I proposed it that way is to go back to the Exodus story. And I want to touch on this a couple of times over the course of our time together this morning, because there are amazing things that happen in that story. My own congregation's Bible study has just been reading Exodus in all its gory detail recently. And you know, the instructions for what to do when you're building this tabernacle are really quite amazing. But one of the things that's really striking is that what Yahweh says to the people is, build me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. The point here is God's presence. But everything they build, part of what they're instructed to do is make 4 rings on the sides and make poles so everything's portable. Everything can go with you into the wilderness. Now, I know enough biblical criticism to know that they're probably actually thinking about the temple and, you know, they weren't really going to carry all this stuff around with them in the wilderness, but it's a great metaphor. It's a great reminder of the way in which God's dwelling among us is constantly on the move, constantly calling us into new places. So I want to talk in this first little section this morning about some of the kinds of wildernesses, the kinds of challenges that we face in the contemporary context, the kinds of things that all people of faith in all different kinds of congregations are facing as they think about how do we construct a tabernacle, a place where God can dwell among us in this situation. And the first challenge I want to talk about is just the fact that people don't stay put in quite the same ways that they may have in the past. That people are moving, they're moving from one job to another, they're moving from one place to another. Our census tells us that every 5 years we have about a quarter of the population that's moving. And actually, about 15% of the population is moving every 5 years. About 10% of those moving at least one county away. Okay, so if you think about where your actual gathering is, and somebody's going to move at least a county away, you can count that as, the proportion of the population in your community that isn't going to be there 5 years from now. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. But when you start adding it up every 5 years, it gets to be quite a lot. And when you think about it generationally, it's even more striking. Because roughly a third of the 18 to 35-year-olds will be in that part of the population that moves county to county. Okay? So if you're thinking about that younger generation of people, you really do have to think about the degree to which, as much as you may be able to gather them in, they're not going to stay put. So if you think about, we're going to gather them, and they're going to be there, they're going to raise their families, and they're going to be buried in our cemetery, probably not. And one of the reasons for that, of course, as you well know, is that jobs aren't like jobs used to be. That people, in fact, are moving from one job to another over the course of their lifetime, and that, again, especially for young adults, it's extremely likely that they've actually been in their current job 2 years or less. 2/3 of 20-somethings have been in their job for 2 years or less. And even the 30-somethings, almost half have been in their jobs 2 years or less. That's a lot of change in people's lives. And one of the things we think about when we think about that for the younger adult population is what it means to be an adult, and sort of how we think about what it means to be an adult. And it's often been that when people kind of think of themselves as, fully an adult and settled down, that's when they get serious about actually coming to church, right? They sow their wild oats, they're sort of moving around, but it's taking much longer these days for people to hit that point, and many don't at all hit sort of all the check boxes for the things we think of as adulthood traditionally, where you've got a full-time job that's stable, where you're financially independent, where you're not living in mom's basement, where you're married, starting to have kids. All those things we've typically sort of checked off, and a couple of generations ago probably would have happened by about age 24 or 25. Now probably aren't happening until more like 35 or even 40, or maybe not at all. So, challenge number 2. It's really related in some ways to all the things that challenge number 1 is about geographic and job mobility, and that is that our communities aren't always defined by geography in quite the same way that they used to. When we think about where home is, we may be thinking about our network of friends on Facebook, or the people who follow us on Twitter, or the people who, access our Tumblr account, or whatever. We may be thinking about a lot of different ways that we form a community. And the irony of that is that we're actually more connected today than we've ever been before. We have broader networks of people that we're in conversation with than we've ever had before, and over a much wider geography. But we have to ask a lot of questions about what the nature of those relationships is. Are these the people who are going to bring you a casserole when you have a new baby? Are these the people on whose shoulder you're going to cry? Are these the people you're going to actually work together with to get things done? Well, sometimes, yes, you are going to work together with the folks that you're connected with on Facebook or Twitter to get things done. And maybe the folks on the Facebook page are going to mobilize the people who do live in your neighborhood to come give you that casserole. So it's a different sense of what community means. We're not just walking down the street, walking to the parish, thinking of the people that we've known in this place over a lifetime. We're thinking about connection in very different ways. So challenge number 3, also related to the other 2. Our households don't look the same as they used to. And a lot of the households in our communities don't fit what we think of as the church mold. So when you think about who's the most likely kind of household that you want to go recruit people to get active in your parish, what are you thinking about? Families? Yeah. Married couples, their kids, especially school age. And in fact, the survey data tell us that that kind of household is the most common household in religious participation. If you're looking at, the real irony here is, if you look at the data from the 1950s, when there were tons of those kinds of households, the proportion of those households, those married couple with children households who were in religious congregations, was roughly the same as the proportion of those kinds of households who are in religious congregations today. Okay? Now here's your secret. The married with kids household, 21% of all households. In the 1950s, that was over 50% of all households were that kind of household. So married without kids, more than married with kids. That is, these are both people before they have kids, because people are getting married and waiting longer to have kids. And we have empty nests for a very long time. single parents, unmarried with no kids, other combinations of all kinds, and then the over 65 living alone and under 65 living alone. And I actually want to call your attention to this one. 10% of households are in the over 65 and living alone. And in fact, that's the fastest growing segment of households. So if you want to know where the demographic action is, it's with us. You know, we always used to, people would get together who were interested in leading congregations and thinking about the future of congregations, and they would talk about, you know, we want to, if you look out over your congregation and it's full of gray hair, you know, you worry about the future of the congregation. Well, yeah, indeed, we're closer to the grave. But if you think about how long people are living post-retirement and the kinds of opportunities that people have post-retirement and how long we're living relatively healthily into our old age. If we say that we're afraid of having people with gray hair in our congregations, we're in big trouble. So, all of that, all of those challenges about the nature of community, about mobility, about the way households look, all of those things mean that it's really challenging to actually get people together in a place and gather a community of people in a parish or a congregation. It's hard to do that. It's challenging in ways that might not have been in the past, when people fit the mold, stayed put, were just next door. But those challenges don't mean that gathering people into a local community, into a local parish, isn't important. It absolutely does not mean that. That, in fact, that scattered character of the world we live in, that disconnectedness that some people can feel, the living alone, all of those kinds of things mean that a parish is in some ways more important than it's ever been before, more critical to people being able to have a sense of meaning and purpose and belonging in their lives. Our parishes are important to the communities in which they are situated. It is still the case that parishes are really important in the network of organizations that supply the very fundamental needs of the community. When I was doing research earlier, looking at questions about how social services get delivered in local communities, it's really striking the degree to which local parishes are really important in all kinds of ways, making the connections, providing the services, providing the volunteers, providing the space, you know, getting that kind of work done in our local communities. So if we don't have parishes, we lose something really important in our communities. We also lose, of course, that sense of a place to belong, a place where even though I may not be here more than 2 or 3 or 4 years, I can still find a kind of extended family, a kind of community, the people who will treat me like they know my name. And this has been especially important, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, especially important for any community of people that doesn't necessarily find itself at home in the larger culture. That is, any community of people that's sort of on the margins of American society, to have a religious community where they can gather is a really important place where language is preserved, customs are preserved, people can have a sense of a home away from home, a sense of connection to people where they can feel like, well, you know, nobody else understands me, but these people do. Now, this is a place that becomes really important. And it becomes important for both minority communities and for everybody else, because parishes are one of the most important places where what we call social capital gets generated. Robert Putnam is famous for sort of popularizing this notion of social capital. And what he means by that is when people voluntarily gather in a group of people and are interacting with each other and working together and so forth, they're building up kind of sensibilities for how to be a person in society that then carries over into the larger culture. So we build up capital in our little face-to-face voluntary groups, and then that capital can get spent in places where we go in other parts of our lives. So what's the capital he's talking about? Well, part of it is that we simply gather with people that we're not kin, that they're otherwise perhaps strangers, and we learn to trust each other. We learn that it's possible to work with people who are maybe not exactly like us, and, not be scared that these are okay people. We learn how to communicate with each other. We learn how to engage in that common labor in the work together. And all of those things that we learn by doing them together in a congregation then become capital that the people in those congregations then can spend in the larger society. Another way to think about this is how it works in terms of our democratic life, our life together as citizens. Another group of political scientists, led by Sidney Verba, also from Harvard, talked about voluntary organizations, again, as places where people gain civic skills. It's a very similar kind of notion here, that when we work together in a voluntary organization, like anything from a PTA to a Rotary Club to some sort of voluntary organization in your neighborhood, to, of course, a parish. Any of the places where we work together like that, one of the things we have to do is learn how to get up in front of people and talk. We have to learn how to perhaps write things for newsletters or write letters or communicate with each other in writing. We have to learn how to organize a meeting. We have to learn how to, once we get people together, preside over the meeting, make decisions, get things done. Well, if you think about what happens in a parish, you've got a parish council, and somebody has to, get up and give a report, and you've got people who are organizing the RCIA classes, and they're, going not only have to organize the stuff, but they're going to have to convince people to come, maybe write newsletter articles, all that stuff that looks like it's just kind of the routine stuff we do in our parishes. All of that has these sort of byproducts, these secondary effects that allow people to learn how to be good citizens. And of course, the political scientists can come along and they can measure it all and indeed crunch the numbers, run the equations and say, yeah, people who learn how to do these things are in fact more likely to vote, more likely to be active participants in American democratic life and so forth. So people who gather in congregations are learning things that are really important for the larger world. One of the other things they learn is how to live by the golden rule, how to be a good person, how to learn what it actually looks like to live this kind of life in the world. They learn it because there are these religious teachings that lay the foundation for why we should live this way. But they learn it also because they see models of people who are living by the golden rule. And they hear stories about what that looks like. They hear the Good Samaritan story. And they also get the very practical networks of information about here's where you can go to volunteer, here's the next blood drive, and they get to actually practice doing these things in an environment where people will say, that was good, that was something that we value, that's important to us. And once we work together doing those kinds of good things together, one of the things that happens is that when we get presented with a problem or an issue or a challenge, we kind of get to the point where we say, we've done that before, we can do that again. There's a sense of agency and empowerment that happens in local congregations. So all of those are the kind of unintended consequences for the larger community that come from the fact that we have parishes, that parishes are together and thriving. And, you know, that's not necessarily why you gather in a religious community. We gather, of course, to worship God, to teach each other about the faith, to honor our heritage and to honor God. And yet in the very midst of doing those things, we are having these larger effects on the communities around us, even when we're not particularly intending to do those things. So gathering people together, gathering into parishes, is something that is more important than ever, more difficult than ever, and more important than ever for sustaining not only our communities, but also our faith. And this is the point at which I want to turn it over to Hosffman to talk particularly about the way this looks around the growing presence of Latino and Hispanic people in our parishes. That's a very particular way in which we are in transition.
Good morning. Well, wonderful. So thank you, Nancy, for somehow giving us this big overall picture of where we are right now and some of the overall transitions. I want to somehow pick up on what you were saying about these challenges and then somehow introduce a fourth challenge that we are facing in terms of transitioning in Catholic churches, in Catholic parishes. And that's how do we deal with cultural, racial dynamics in transitions in the Catholic Church. No? Now, this is not the first time that Catholic communities actually in the United States transition into something new. As a matter of fact, we know that Catholicism is not even an American experience. You know? Catholicism was imported, and the first Catholics in this country were from where? They were Hispanics, remember? They were not Irish, you know. They were not Irish, they were not German, were not Portuguese. They happened to be Hispanic, you know, first Spaniards, you know. So we have these Catholics, and there have been many models throughout the history of Catholicism in the United States that somehow point to this idea that we are not, you know, I love that idea of tabernacles, you know, that sometimes we have just to pick up and move, no, into something new. Well, for instance, the first model of Catholic parish that we have in the United States is missions. We had tons of missions in the Southwest, the Southeast. Some of them, you know, run by the Jesuits, others run by the Franciscans, the Augustinians. That was the first model of Catholic parish that we had in this country, in the United States, even before the country became the United States of America. No? Then we had the model of national parishes, and I will say a little bit more about these national parishes in a moment. But we shifted, you know, with a new population, a new set of needs. Then there was the emergence of national parishes that fulfilled a particular kind of role in helping Catholics in the United States to settle, you know, and thrive. But then from alongside national parishes, we also have some of what's called the ethnic or racial communities. No? For instance, we know that in our history, well, Catholics haven't done that well in terms of, particularly in the last couple of centuries, we haven't done that well integrating our communities racially and ethnically. I mean, there were times in our own history when white Catholics did not worship with black Catholics. And white Catholics did not worship with Hispanic Catholics or Asian American Catholics or Native American Catholics, So that's part of our own history. So then, you had the black Catholic churches, the Hispanic Catholic churches developing in somewhat independent ways, alongside with these national churches. But still, models that respond to the needs of the particular community. Then, we are in what's today, what today we call the multicultural parish, or the shared parish, which is another way of looking at this community. And I will say more about this particular because this is the parish of today, the shared parish, the multicultural parish. And there's actually a new transition which connects very much with that population that is always on the move, that Nancy was describing. And it's the somewhat parish of choice, in many ways, Some of my colleagues with whom I engage in conversations call it the boutique parish, So that parish, that, well, I don't like the priest in this parish, then I will go and find a parish that actually fits my needs, I like my preaching, I like someone to cater to my needs. Well, this priest is too conservative, this is too liberal, so I'll just find, I like Mass in Latin, I like Mass in Spanish, I like, Mass with music, Mexican music, or, I like Mass with, the classical music, the organ. So we all go and search that parish of choice. But that's going to be the next talk that Nancy and I are going to talk, are going to give, at some point when Boston College invites us again to do this, But for now, let's try to settle on let's take a look at history quickly, Why? Because we're talking about transition. And if we are talking about transition, we need to know, at least from a Catholic perspective, to know what are we transitioning from, What is it that from where are we coming, and where is it that we are going, So let me just give you a quick sense of our own history, And the first one is Catholic, demographers, or demographers speak of, different waves of migration, in the general population, there have been 3 major waves of migration into the United States. But for Catholics, it's 2 major waves of migration. The first major wave of migration that we can speak, is Catholics from Europe, mostly from Europe, Germans and Italians and Irish and Portuguese, just name it, Polish. So you got all these people coming mostly in the 19th century, early 20th century. And what's the first thing that a Catholic does when this person gets into a new country? You go and look for a church, isn't it? Well, if you're a practicing Catholic, of course. They go and look for a church. So all these millions of Catholics from Europe arrive in the United States for many reasons, Some of them were being persecuted, some of them were hungry, some of them were looking for a job. The American dream, coming to America, new place. So they come to the United States, 19th century, and then, back then the Catholic Church was very incipient. The structures of the church, there were almost no structures all throughout the country. So they came to many of these Irish and Italians and Polish Catholics came, and they came to the bishop's doors, and they just knocked on the door. So the bishop opens the door, and then 4 million Catholics waiting outside. Like, oh man, it's like, so bishop, we need a parish. And the bishop said, I'm sorry, but I don't have parishes for so many people, Well, these immigrants said, on our way to, from Europe, crossing the big pond, we actually brought in some priests with us. They can say Mass, but we don't have a place. So they came to an arrangement. And the arrangement was very simple, The bishop said, okay, you build the churches, and I will allow you to have those churches. Yeah, and then people said, sure, we'll build the churches, but the Italians said, we want Mass and everything done in Italian. And the bishop said, well, sure, do it. Why not, isn't it? Well, the Irish looked at the Italians and said, well, we also want to do some of that as well, And the Polish and the Portuguese. And somehow, that's the rise of the national parishes in the United States. It was a fascinating movement. As a matter of fact, early in the 19th century, just a few hundred of parishes were set up, Catholic parishes were set up in the United States, just a few hundreds. By the middle of the 20th century, in a period of 150 years, 21,000, actually 22,000 parishes had been built. We went, in 150 years, we went from just a handful of parishes to about 22,000 parishes. Most of them national parishes, no, most of them. So national parishes in many ways served as oases for immigrants, for immigrants. Why? Because learning a new language is not easy. Learning a new culture is not easy. And Catholic in national parishes actually served, like this kind of third spaces for immigrant communities. So the Germans, what did they do? They replicated German Catholicism in the communities. And so did the Irish and the Polish and the Italians and everybody. They replicated their Catholicism, So this idea that sometimes I hear from people like, my parents came from, or my grandparents came from Italy or from whatever country in Europe, and the following day they spoke English and had a high-paying job, I doubt it, It might have, maybe one or two people who could have gone that way, but most immigrants struggled. We should not romanticize their experience because it is actually the struggle that somehow allowed them to thrive. And Catholic parishes served as these places that allowed them to do this, no? Well, so the first generation dies, then their children, and then what happens is the natural thing in every transition from generation to generation. Children start speaking more English, they become more used to the new realities, and then parishes begin to change. By the third, fourth generation, when migration from Europe dwindles, then these national parishes that were only German, only Italian, only Polish, only X, Y, and Z, become American parish, Americanized parish. English language, and it doesn't matter if your parents came from X or Y country, pretty much we are part of this American Catholicism. Those are the parishes that were left from this huge movement, this huge movement. Those are our parishes, the parishes where you and I worship these days, these are the communities. So Catholics, somehow developed, different structures. Not only Catholics built one of the largest networks of of parishes in the United States, but also one of the largest networks of Catholic schools in the world, as a matter of fact, So, well, Catholic children were going to public schools, and then Catholics were worried back then that children were being Protestantized. How horrible, It's just like so they're reading the King James Bible, they're not being affirmed in their Catholic identity. So that was a concern, that they had. They also were worried that in some cases Catholic children were being mistreated in public schools because of their Catholic faith. So again, they go back to their bishops. The bishops, they say, well, how can we help you? Well, our children, need a place to be educated. So the bishops, go into the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, 1800s, late 1800s, 1883 or so. And then, they come up with this big, wild solution. Here it is. Every parish in the United States must build a Catholic school. Wow, Catholic school. And well, a lot of pastors said, no way, we don't have the money, we're not gonna do it, I don't know what the bishops have been drinking. So what we're gonna do is, but many priests and many parishes actually took the bishops on their word. And they built more than 12,500 Catholic schools in the United States. Amazing. The miracle of Catholic schools, by the middle of the 19th century, by the middle of the 20th century, 55% of all Catholic children in this country were going to Catholic schools. And that catapulted Catholics almost in one generation, 2 generations, into middle upper class, thanks to education. It's fascinating. So here, let's go back to the parishes. So we have all these parishes. So technically, we have a large network of communities that served as oases, but transitioned into what's today called the American parish. We went, and then Catholic schools, helped the process of transition of Catholics. And pretty much by the 1950s, Catholics could celebrate. It was a success story, my friends. Successful story. We could sing Kumbaya, in the 1950s. We had these, the cardinals from Boston, for instance, Cardinal O'Connell, Cardinal Cushing, the great days of the Catholic Church. We even had a Catholic president in the United States. What else could you ask for? That was the Catholic dream at its best, Catholic parishes really helped to contribute to this particular process. So, well, but what happened is that life moves on, So at some point, we have to pack up, pick up, and move on. We couldn't freeze time right there. And there was a new transition, another big transition. That's the one that takes us into the second wave, And the second wave, of Catholics, well, this time, the 1965 Immigration Act somehow narrows the doors of immigration from Europe, and then opens them up to Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and the rest of the world. And then what's fascinating is that, as Euro-American Catholics, mostly middle class, highly educated, with nice parishes, beautiful parishes, this is the time of Vatican II, time to be revolutionary, time for changes, time for education, and so forth. And then what happens is that, a number of, the migration shifts from Europe largely to Latin America. And in Latin America, well, let me just give you some, some numbers for us to at least, think about the impact. So here we have, how many Irish in total came between the 19th century and the 20th century? Just give me an educated number. 8 million, less than that, half of that, as a matter of fact, a little bit more than 4 million, How many Italians? About 5 million, a little bit more. How many Germans? About 5 million, half of that. So, yes, but those are good guesses, no? So we got 5 million of here, 3 million here, 2 million here, 4 million here, and so forth, But then, in Latin America, something happens. There are two things. Latin America is this collection of these 21 countries that are mostly Spanish-speaking, except for Brazil and Belize, And then you've got all these countries that there are two things that unify them, One is language, Espanol, Spanish, and the other one is religion, Catholicism. So technically, here you start seeing all this, this huge migration from Latin America into the United States, mostly Catholics, mostly Spanish-speaking. And it's not 4 million, or 5, or 10, or 15, or 20, or 25. It's about 30 million people from Latin America that have arrived in the United States since the beginning of the 20th century. So, my friends, it was not a wave from Latin America. It was a tsunami. It's just like this big thing. And it's a tsunami that challenges the Catholic Church in its structures. Let me ask the question again. What's the first thing that Catholics do when they arrive in a new nation? They look for a church, isn't it? Well, these Hispanic Catholics also came to look for a church, and not only Hispanic Catholics, but there's also a major wave of migration from Asia, particularly from Southeast Asia, and also from Africa. And then, these people come to these churches, and they go to their bishops, and their bishop said, "Bishop, we want a parish." And the bishop said, "Well, we have good news and bad news. What do you want to hear first, Well, I'll give you the bad news. National parishes are a thing of the past. We cannot have national parishes anymore." Like, how come? Well, in 1983, the new Code of Canon Law was revised. Look at there. And the national parish, the idea of a national parish was stricken out. And they created the figure, or the canonical figure, called personal parish. What's a personal parish? It is a community that is designated by the bishop at his will to serve the particular needs of a community. It could be a Hispanic community, it could be a community of deaf Catholics, blind Catholics, could be any community. What's interesting is that bishops in the United States since the 1980s have largely refrained from creating personal parishes to serve the needs, particularly of Hispanics. Why? Because the number of Hispanics has exploded, you know? So we cannot replicate this idea of having half the church in national parishes again, and the other half being in so-called regular parishes. So now the good news. The good news is that we have a bunch of parishes out there, you know? We have 20,000 parishes, you know, all throughout the country, and you are gonna go and worship in these communities. So Hispanics say, well, great, we don't have to build these churches, no? There's no need for that. But guess who didn't like the idea that much? The established church, the established Catholics who were singing Kumbaya, you know, we're now middle class, you know, we have our churches, you know, we're highly educated, we have a president, we made it, we did it, you know? This is Dora the Explorer. My children make me watch Dora the Explorer, so that's what she says. We made it, we did it, you know? So, yeah, we have made it, and now you want us to share our parishes. Really? Is that what you want? And the bishop said, yes. Now, this is the future. And then, what's fascinating is that, well, a pastor says, but I don't speak Spanish. And the bishop says, well, now you have to learn Spanish, my friend, you know? Oh, but we don't know any Vietnamese. Well, you've got to polish your Vietnamese somehow, you know? And that somehow changes the new wave of being, new ways of being Catholic in the United States. Now, in the past, your American Catholics invested in the idea of assimilation. The idea was leave behind those languages and practices as quickly as you can and become Americanized. That's and Catholic schools actually served as an instrument to do that. Today, the new generations of Asians, African, and Latino Catholics are resisting assimilation. So now they're calling for integration. In other words, in the past, the idea was that parishes needed to be both Catholic and American. Today, we are investing, the new generations are investing in being Catholic, American, and Latino, Asian, African, and so forth, you know? So in a sense, what we are facing right now is a whole question of the politics of identity in Catholic parishes. And you and I are involved in this. What's very interesting is that as Hispanics, you know, somehow want to affirm the Latino identity, now we're beginning to see white Catholics in the United States also affirming a white identity. And that is great. That's great. But the question is that we need to learn how to do it. And I'm going to give you a few tips afterwards when we get to the second part of these presentations. So who are Catholics in the United States? Non-Hispanic whites. Well, forget that number. Okay. If you were born in the 1950s, don't raise your hands, you know, or around that time, you know, what percentage of Catholics in the United States were white? 95%. 95% in the United States. Hispanics were just 2-3%, and they were just mostly in California, you know, and actually the word Hispanic didn't exist in the 1950s. No, we didn't use it. The census didn't use it. You know, how do we call these people in the 1950s? No, not even Chicanos. We call them the Spanish-speaking, you know? Like, what? But, you know, many Latinos, actually millions of Latinos do not speak Spanish, you know? And they said, well, we're not Spanish-speaking. So eventually they settled on the idea, well, let's call them the Mexicans, you know? Well, so if you're in California, everybody's Mexican, you know, of course. You know? Well, I was born in Nicaragua. Mexican, man. You're in California, you know? And if you are born, if you live in Florida, everybody is Cubano, Cuban, you know, everyone's Cuban. Well, I was born in Colombia, Cuban. You're in Miami, you know, Chico. No, it's just right. And then, then if you're in New England, you're in New York, you're in Connecticut, you're in Boston, everybody is Puerto Rican. Well, that's how it happens, you know. So 95% only 60 years ago. Look at what happened in less than a century, in less than half a century. Non-Hispanic whites went from 95% to about 47%. And the number keeps declining, 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 and aging at the same time, you know? Hispanics went from being 3%, only a few decades ago, to being 43% today, you know? So you better start polishing your Spanish skills, you know, friends, because African Americans, about 3.6% today. Asians, fastest growing group in the Catholic Church in the United States, Asians, okay? 5%. So we also need to start polishing our Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean skills, because that's ministry in the 21st century. And Native Americans, about 1%. Welcome to the Catholic Church in the United States. My question for you is, do your parishes reflect this demographic breakdown? Ouch, okay. That's where we need to start working, no? So by 2020, Hispanics will constitute about 50% of the entire Catholic Church, the Catholic population, you know, or the population in the Catholic Church. And this is not a threat. It's just demographics. That's just happening, you know? So what's been happening here? Most of us, the future of Catholicism in the United States will largely be linked to these multicultural dynamics. Today, 40% of all parishes in the United States, we have closed many parishes. We have gone from 22,000 plus to about 17,000. We have closed more than 5,000 parishes in this country, you know, in the last few decades. So, of the 17,000 plus parishes, we have, 40% are multicultural parishes, meaning parishes that celebrate Mass in a language other than English as well. How many of you, for instance, are part of one of these communities? Parishes that celebrate in a language more than English, including Latin, no? So, there you have it. A few of you come from these communities. So, that's the future. How did these communities transition? Well, one of the, Catholics, we've been fussy in many ways as to deal with diversity, throughout our history. For instance, the multicultural parishes, or dealing with cultural diversity, we have experimented in many ways. The first experiment that was very popular and dominant in the early 20th century was the first one, different communities. So you have different communities, separate parishes. This is the result of segregation, my friends. Blacks could not worship with whites. Whites did not worship with Hispanics. Hispanics did not worship with blacks. Father Virgilio Elizondo, Mexican-American theologian, tells the story that when he was with his friends, when he was a child in the 1930s, I think 40s, he's not that old, 1940s, 50s in Texas, there used to be fountains, in the parks, fountains for white people, fountains for black people. But he was Hispanic, so his white friends would go to the white fountain, his black friends would go to the black fountain, but he couldn't go to either one because there were no fountains for Hispanics, That's the segregation. And churches actually did exactly the same thing, Segregation, different communities, separate parishes. By the 1950s, particularly after Second World War II, there is a little bit of a transition. Well, parishes, there's the idea of integration. Let's bring people together. But integration is not easy, and we know that, So there was a push on the part of the bishops to bring Hispanics and blacks and whites and Native Americans together in the same parishes. And they did in many parts of the country, but it was the whole idea, we are members of we're different communities, And we're in the same parish, but we remain different, you know? And that's where you have, for instance, you know, one group upstairs and the other group up downstairs. No, and that's an image that is very charged, you know, politically charged. Today doesn't mean that much, you know, because today many communities actually choose to be in the basement because it's actually a cozier church, you know, or a smaller community. In any case, so you have separate communities, one parish. That's how these communities begin to transition. What has been the third transition? Today, we are one parish, and all communities are beginning to mix. Welcome to Catholicism in the 21st century. And to conclude, you know, this first part, I just want to give you a little bit of a map of parishes, you know, and how they have been built in the United States. And I'm going to focus on Hispanics because this is the research that I do mostly, you know. But notice, look at this map, you know. 61% of all parishes in the United States were built in the Northeast and the Midwest. 61%. Yet, you know, so that leaves 39% of all parishes in the South and the West. However, as we look into the 21st century, the growth of Catholicism is not in the Midwest or the Northeast. The growth of the Catholic Church in this country is being driven by Hispanics and Asians primarily. And where do Hispanics and Asians live? South and the West. The South and the West. So technically, what we're facing right now, what we're facing is the reality that we have a church with a lot of resources and few people in the Northeast, Midwest, and then a lot of people in the South and the West, but with few resources. Are we ready to share? Are we ready to enter into new models of being Catholic parish? What would be the parish of the future? That's the question that I hope this workshop, you know, starts raising, because there is not one solution for anything, for any of this. But the purpose of our presentations today is to raise awareness and start working together into imagining what the Catholic parish of the 21st century will look like in light of these realities. Thank you. So now we're going to ask you to just turn around and in groups of 3 or 4 people, you know, just where you are, you know, from what you have heard from Nancy and me at this very, during the last 50 minutes. It's already 50 minutes, you know. Time flies when you're having fun, isn't it? I'm having fun. I don't know you. Well, just again. So what we're going to do is, what are some of your initial reactions to what you have heard? You know, how what Nancy has exposed and what I have shared with you somehow challenge you in terms of your own communities and your parish. Let's take about 5 minutes in your small groups, and then we'll hear a few people.
Reactions, responses, questions, objections. Yeah, in the back. Great.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm from Sacred Heart in Roslindale. And one question that was jumping out at me when Hosffman was talking was, our parish is probably about 50% Hispanic, and there's a noon mass, which is the Spanish mass, which is usually a lot more crowded than any of the English masses. And we have had a very, very difficult time finding Hispanic pastors or priests. The most recent one was a guy that should have retired 10 years ago. They kept upping the age on him, whom I felt very bad for. And now another guy has come in. He's from Argentina, but he's lived here for, The thing that doesn't seem to have happened with Hispanic communities, at least in Boston, is that their priests didn't come with them. There's no Dominican priests that I know of available here. We had one priest at Blessed Sacrament in Jamaica Plain who spoke very good Spanish with a very thick Boston accent. And I'm just wondering about this aspect of the whole migration.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So many of your European immigrant Catholics came with their clergy their sisters as well, But Hispanics, unfortunately, did not do that, So, and again, it's because it has to do a lot with the proximity of, to Latin America. So currently, about 90% of Hispanic priests in the United States are immigrant priests, So it's not because the community brought them with them, but they have been sent by Latin America as missionaries, or sometimes dioceses negotiate with dioceses in the Latin American countries to have them here. Should we expect or hope for a new wave of Latin American priests to arrive and serve these communities? That actually is not the solution, And bishops are shifting quickly to the idea that we need to foster vocations to the ordained priesthood, religious life, lay ecclesial ministry among Latinos in the United States, And that requires investment, particularly in Hispanic youth. And that's what we're not doing that well.
Yeah, other comments? We've got another comment over here.
My name is Charlie Ferraro. I'm from St. Irene's in Carlisle. And just to follow up on that, we had an experience that's a little bit different, where we were trying to fill the priest shortage that you're talking about by bringing in priests that are studying in this area. So we've gone through a series now of 3 African priests. And it's been very interesting because we all know that the community is becoming more and more global. And as a result of that, there is such an interest, especially among the youth, to understand what's going on globally. And so we've seen in our parish that by these priests coming in and helping us fill the priest shortage, there's an expansion and an understanding amongst the youth of the universal church. And it's having a very positive effect. And then the second indication we see is that the Rwanda, in this case, the priest that's with us now is Rwandan. And so we're seeing Rwandans who are settling in the Boston market coming to our parish. And it's having this very beautiful effect on the parish and on the youth. Getting to what you were talking about earlier, about how the struggles of the immigrants is what really built the churches. So our parish, especially our kids, are being exposed to that struggle. And it's having an impact. And our parish in particular has gotten involved in helping them in their communities in Africa. So I think it's a slightly different model than what you're talking about. But I think it's a dynamic model because it happens by choice as opposed to being in a forced situation. And so it builds a really strong sense of what you talked about earlier in terms of community.
Yeah, that sense of global connection is really interesting. I put the slide up earlier about the connections around the world, that we are in fact more globally connected than we've ever been before, and it's more and more possible for people who are in one location to have a sense of real connection to places elsewhere. Sometimes it's their home that they're staying connected to, but sometimes by virtue of being in relationship with others here, they sort of take us to their home. And I think that's a really interesting example, an important one for us to hear. One more comment before we go to break.
Oh, our group is diverse here. Thank you. Chris came from California. Barbara has been abroad in the Middle East and is now in Wellesley. And I'm working as a campus minister at Bridgewater State, which is next to Brockton. Chris has a very interesting, I think it models what Hosffman has said, that they already in those churches are integrating what were once separate ministries, Hispanic ministries and American or white ministries are now being integrated. Barbara said that in Wellesley, they have very few Hispanic people. And I find that Bridgewater, the parish itself, is quite homogeneous. But I observe Brockton, where there is an older, adult Cape Verdean, Haitian population, and many Hispanic Latin American countries coming in and integrated. But in Bridgewater, what's interesting here is the young students who come from abroad to study are except the Belizeans, are pretty much evangelical. They are going to the Protestant churches. And then Bridgewater itself, from the adult population, is, as I said, homogeneous. So there are very few students, Catholic, Hispanic speaking, coming to the chapel at Bridgewater State because most of them have gone to the Protestant faith.
One more, quick. Yeah.
I'm from the Diocese of Portland, Maine, and cover the state. And I think this whole issue is very interesting for me. In the state of Maine, we have very few priests that speak Spanish, none of them Hispanic. They're in the South. And in September, I prepared a family of 4 hours in the state of Maine, 4 hours away, for baptism. That child still has not been baptized because I can't find a priest to go up there to baptize them. They want it in Spanish. They're also asking for confessions. We have some priests that supposedly the seminarians are supposed to be learning Spanish. They come to the state of Maine and they don't want to speak it. They say, oh, I don't know it well enough. So it is a big issue. So many of the people right now are going to the evangelical churches because they're the ones that are welcoming them.
Lots of really nitty-gritty issues that you all are dealing with. And we're going to come back after break and talk about some of those really basic questions about how this work at the local level gets done. Let's take about 10 minutes. I think there are goodies out there, and there's also a bookstore out there. So we'll see you back shortly.